The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Westminster, as Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell reviewed the case files spread across her desk. 3 weeks had passed since the most bizarre incident in recent London police history, and she was no closer to understanding what had happened outside Buckingham Palace. Marcus Dane had been an ordinary accountant until 6 months ago. He worked for a small firm in Croydon, lived alone in a modest flat, and had no criminal record. His colleagues described him as quiet, reliable, and unremarkable. That was before everything changed. The first sign of trouble came when Marcus discovered irregularities in his company's books. Large sums of money were being funneled through fake accounts, and the trail led directly to his boss, William Crawford. Marcus had always been thorough with numbers, and these discrepancies kept him awake at night. He spent weeks double-checking his calculations, hoping he was wrong. When Marcus finally approached Crawford about the missing funds, his boss's reaction was swift and terrifying. Crawford didn't deny the accusations. Instead, he made a phone call in front of Marcus, speaking in hushed tones to someone he called the collector. Marcus caught fragments of the conversation that made his blood run cold. "The accountant knows too much," Crawford said into the phone. "Yes, I understand. It will be handled tonight." Marcus realized he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than simple embezzlement. The money was being laundered for a criminal organization that Crawford feared more than prison. That evening, Marcus packed a small bag and disappeared from his flat, leaving behind his entire life. For months, Marcus lived like a ghost in London's shadows. He slept in hostels under fake names, ate at different cafes each day, and constantly watched over his shoulder. He had tried going to the police initially, but Detective Sergeant Williams, the officer who took his statement, seemed oddly uninterested in pursuing the case. Marcus later discovered that Williams had connections to the same criminal network. The stress of constant hiding began taking its toll on Marcus's mental state. He started seeing threats everywhere, believing that ordinary pedestrians were following him. His paranoia grew so intense that he began carrying a replica gun he had purchased from a prop shop, thinking it might help him feel safer. Meanwhile, the criminal organization was indeed searching for him. They had people in various positions throughout London, including some within the police force. The collector, whose real name was Vincent Moreau, ran a sophisticated operation that dealt in money laundering, arms trafficking, and information trading. Marcus represented a significant threat to their operations. Detective Inspector Mitchell had been investigating similar cases for years. She suspected corruption within her own department but had never been able to prove it. When Marcus's case file crossed her desk, she noticed the same patterns she had seen before. Witnesses who suddenly changed their stories, evidence that mysteriously disappeared, and investigations that were closed prematurely. The breakthrough came when Marcus made a desperate decision. After months of running, he realized that the only way to expose the truth was to create a public spectacle that couldn't be ignored or covered up. He needed to force the authorities to take action, even if it meant sacrificing himself. Marcus spent days planning his approach to Buckingham Palace. He studied the guard rotations, the tourist patterns, and the media schedules. He knew that the morning changing of the guard ceremony would guarantee maximum visibility. His plan was simple but risky. Create enough of a disturbance to attract attention, then disappear before anyone could stop him. On the morning of the incident, Marcus positioned himself among the tourists gathering to watch the ceremony. He wore a dark coat and baseball cap, trying to blend in with the crowd. His hands shook as he touched the replica weapon hidden in his jacket. He had practiced his escape route dozens of times, using the underground tunnels and maintenance passages he had discovered during his months of hiding. The royal guard stood at attention outside the palace gates, their red uniforms and tall black hats creating an imposing presence. Tourists snapped photos and chattered excitedly, unaware of the drama about to unfold. Marcus waited for the perfect moment when the crowd was at its largest and the media cameras were rolling. At precisely 10:30, Marcus stepped forward from the crowd and approached the nearest guard. Royal Guard James Morrison had been on duty for 2 years and had never experienced anything like what was about to happen. He noticed Marcus approaching but initially thought he was just another tourist seeking directions. Marcus pulled out the replica weapon and pointed it directly at Morrison. The crowd immediately erupted in screams and panic. People scattered in all directions. some dropping their cameras and bags in their haste to escape. The other guards immediately raised their own weapons, creating a tense standoff that lasted only seconds but felt like hours. "I have information about corruption in the Metropolitan Police," Marcus shouted loud enough for the gathering media to hear. "Detective Sergeant Williams is working with criminals. The case files are in locker 247 at Victoria Station." Before anyone could react, Marcus threw a smoke grenade he had prepared earlier. The area around the palace gates filled with thick gray smoke, reducing visibility to almost zero. In the chaos that followed, Marcus activated his escape plan. Security cameras later showed Marcus running toward a maintenance entrance near the palace grounds. But then the footage became unclear due to the smoke. By the time the smoke cleared and backup arrived, Marcus had vanished completely. The only evidence of his presence was the replica gun he had dropped and the lingering smell of the smoke grenade. The incident made international headlines within hours. Videos taken by tourists went viral on social media, showing the dramatic confrontation and Marcus's mysterious disappearance. The palace issued a statement downplaying the severity of the threat, but the damage to their security reputation was significant. Detective Inspector Mitchell watched the news coverage with growing interest. Marcus's shouted message about Detective Sergeant Williams had not been lost on her. She had suspected Williams of corruption for years, and now she had a specific lead to follow. The mention of locker 247 at Victoria Station gave her hope that Marcus might have left behind the evidence needed to expose the entire criminal network. Detective Inspector Mitchell arrived at Victoria Station 45 minutes after the incident at Buckingham Palace. She knew she had to act quickly before anyone else connected Marcus's words to the locker he had mentioned. The station was bustling with its usual mix of commuters and tourists, providing perfect cover for her investigation. Locker 247 was located in the lower level of the station, tucked away in a section that most travelers rarely visited. Mitchell approached carefully, scanning the area for anyone who might be watching. Her years of experience had taught her that corruption cases required extreme caution, especially when fellow officers might be involved. The locker required a combination, but Mitchell noticed scratch marks around the lock mechanism. Someone had opened it recently. She called in a specialist to bypass the lock without damaging potential evidence inside. When the door finally swung open, she found a treasure trove of documents that would change everything. Marcus had been incredibly thorough in his documentation. The locker contained photocopied bank statements, recorded conversations on digital devices, photographs of meetings between Crawford and known criminals, and detailed notes about police officers who had been compromised. Most importantly, there was a complete financial trail showing how money flowed from legitimate businesses through Crawford's accounting firm and into criminal enterprises. Detective Sergeant Williams featured prominently in the documents. Marcus had managed to photograph him meeting with Vincent Moreau on 3 separate occasions. The photos showed Williams accepting envelopes that almost certainly contained cash payments. There were also records of cases that Williams had deliberately mishandled or evidence he had made disappear. While Mitchell secured the evidence, the search for Marcus intensified across London. The Metropolitan Police had mobilized dozens of officers, but their efforts were hampered by the fact that some of them were unknowingly working against each other. The honest officers were genuinely trying to locate a dangerous fugitive, while the corrupt ones were under orders to find Marcus before he could cause more damage. Marcus, meanwhile, had successfully navigated the underground tunnel system he had spent months mapping. These tunnels connected various points throughout central London, originally built for utilities and maintenance but largely forgotten by the modern city above. He had discovered them during his time in hiding and had carefully prepared multiple escape routes. His current hideout was an abandoned section of the tube system, closed to the public for over 20 years. Marcus had slowly moved supplies there over several weeks, creating a small living space complete with battery-powered lights, a camping stove, and enough food and water to last several days. The location was perfect because it was virtually invisible to standard police searches. Vincent Moreau was furious about the morning's events. His organization had spent years building their network of corrupt officials and legitimately positioned assets. Marcus's public display threatened to unravel everything they had worked to create. Moreau convened an emergency meeting with his lieutenants to discuss their options. The meeting took place in a warehouse in East London that served as a front for their operations. Moreau was a tall, thin man in his 50s who spoke with a slight French accent. His appearance was unremarkable, which had served him well in his criminal career. People tended to forget him, making it easier to operate without drawing attention. "The accountant has caused considerable damage," Moreau told his assembled team. "Every police officer, corrupt or otherwise, is now looking for him. We need to find him first and eliminate this threat permanently." Moreau's lieutenant, a heavy-set man named Tommy Ross, raised concerns about the evidence Marcus might have collected. "What if he's already given copies to journalists or other police officers? Killing him might not solve our problem." Moreau had considered this possibility. His organization's survival depended on staying ahead of law enforcement, and Marcus represented an unprecedented threat. "We'll deal with that when we find him. Our priority is locating him before the honest police do." Back at Victoria Station, Detective Inspector Mitchell was coordinating with her most trusted colleagues to process the evidence Marcus had left behind. She knew that time was critical and that some members of her own department couldn't be trusted with this information. Mitchell contacted Chief Inspector Reynolds, one of the few senior officers she was certain wasn't compromised. Reynolds had been investigating police corruption for years and immediately understood the significance of Marcus's evidence. Together, they began planning how to use the information to build cases against Williams and others involved in the network. The media coverage of the Palace incident continued to dominate news cycles throughout the day. International outlets picked up the story, focusing on the security breach at one of Britain's most protected locations. The mysterious nature of Marcus's disappearance captured public imagination, with social media users sharing theories about how he had vanished so completely. Royal Guard Morrison, who had been directly threatened during the incident, was interviewed by investigators. He described Marcus as appearing desperate rather than dangerous, noting that the man's hands had been shaking and his voice had cracked when he shouted his message about police corruption. "He didn't seem like a terrorist or a criminal," Morrison told investigators. "He seemed scared, like someone running out of options. The way he looked at me, it was almost apologetic." This description matched what Detective Inspector Mitchell was learning about Marcus from his former colleagues and neighbors. Everyone described him as a gentle, honest person who had never shown any signs of violence or instability. The transformation into someone desperate enough to threaten a royal guard suggested he was under extreme pressure. Meanwhile, Marcus was monitoring news coverage of the incident using a small radio in his underground hideout. He was pleased that his message about Detective Sergeant Williams had been broadcast, but he worried that the evidence in the locker might not be enough to bring down the entire network. He had more information hidden elsewhere, but retrieving it would require venturing back into areas where he might be recognized. The criminal organization's search efforts were becoming more sophisticated. They had contacts throughout London's underworld who could access areas and information that the police couldn't. Street criminals, homeless individuals, and workers in various service industries were all part of an informal network that Moreau could activate when needed. One such contact was Maria Santos, who managed a cleaning service that worked in government buildings and corporate offices. Maria had been providing information to Moreau's organization for 3 years, helping them identify potential targets and security weaknesses. She was now tasked with coordinating the search for Marcus in areas the police might overlook. Detective Inspector Mitchell was becoming increasingly concerned about information leaks within the investigation. Despite her efforts to limit access to the evidence, word about the locker and its contents seemed to be spreading within the department. She suspected that there were more corrupt officers than just Williams, and that they were reporting back to whoever was behind the criminal network. Her suspicions were confirmed when she noticed surveillance teams following her own movements. The teams were too professional to be standard police units, suggesting that private investigators or criminals were tracking her activities. This realization forced Mitchell to become even more cautious about her investigation methods. The first day, after the incident ended with Marcus still free and the evidence he had, provided beginning to reveal the scope of the corruption problem. Mitchell knew that the next 24 hours would be crucial in determining whether the truth would come to light or whether the criminal network would succeed in covering up their activities once again. The second day brought new challenges for everyone involved in the unfolding drama. Detective Inspector Mitchell arrived at her office to find that Detective Sergeant Williams had not reported for duty. His absence confirmed her suspicions about his involvement in the criminal network, but it also meant he was now aware that the investigation was closing in on him. Williams had spent the night destroying evidence in his home and preparing to disappear. He had always known this day might come, and Moreau's organization had provided him with false identification documents and emergency funds. Williams understood that staying in London was no longer safe, but he also knew that running would confirm his guilt. Marcus woke in his underground hideout feeling exhausted but determined. His dramatic gesture at Buckingham Palace had succeeded in drawing attention to the corruption, but he knew the job was far from finished. He had additional evidence hidden in 3 other locations around London, and he needed to retrieve it before the criminals found him. The first location was a gym locker in Canary Wharf where Marcus had hidden financial records showing connections between Crawford's accounting firm and several shell companies. The second was a left luggage facility at King's Cross Station, containing audio recordings of conversations between Williams and other corrupt officials. The third was the most dangerous to access, a safety deposit box at a bank in the city that contained the most damaging evidence of all. Vincent Moreau had not slept since the incident. His organization was under unprecedented scrutiny, and several of his legitimate business fronts were now at risk of investigation. Moreau knew that Marcus possessed information that could destroy everything he had built over the past decade. Finding the accountant had become his absolute priority. Moreau's search teams had been working through the night, checking hotels, hostels, and any location where Marcus might be hiding. They had also been monitoring electronic communications and financial transactions, hoping to catch any trace of his activities. So far, Marcus had been completely invisible to their efforts. Detective Inspector Mitchell was coordinating with Chief Inspector Reynolds and a small team of trusted officers to build cases against the corrupt officials identified in Marcus's evidence. They had already begun surveillance on several suspects and were preparing search warrants for their homes and offices. However, they knew that moving too quickly might alert other members of the network. The media attention surrounding the Palace incident was creating additional pressure on all sides. Journalists were investigating the story independently, following leads that sometimes conflicted with the official police investigation. Some reporters had already identified Marcus by name and were trying to track down his background and motivations. One journalist, Sarah Chen from The Guardian, had been investigating police corruption for months before the Palace incident. She recognized the significance of Marcus's public statement and began connecting it to her existing research. Chen had sources within the criminal justice system who had been providing her with information about suspicious case outcomes and evidence handling. Chen's investigation was proceeding parallel to Mitchell's official inquiry, but with different resources and constraints. As a journalist, she could pursue leads that the police couldn't, but she also lacked the authority to compel cooperation from witnesses. Chen decided to focus on the financial aspects of the corruption, following money trails through public records and corporate filings. Marcus spent the morning carefully planning his route to the Canary Wharf gym. He had studied the area extensively and knew that the high concentration of security cameras and police presence made it extremely dangerous. However, the evidence he had hidden there was crucial to proving the full extent of the criminal network's operations. He waited until the lunch hour rush when the area would be crowded with office workers, providing cover for his movements. Marcus had altered his appearance by shaving his beard and wearing glasses, but he knew that sophisticated facial recognition systems might still identify him. The gym was located on the 3rd floor of a modern office building. Marcus had maintained a membership there during his normal life, before everything changed. The staff knew him, which created both an advantage and a risk. They might not look closely at someone familiar, but they might also remember seeing him after his disappearance became public knowledge. Marcus successfully retrieved the documents from the gym locker without incident. The papers contained detailed financial records showing how money from drug sales and arms trafficking was being laundered through seemingly legitimate businesses. Crawford's accounting firm was just one part of a much larger operation that included restaurants, construction companies, and import-export businesses. While Marcus was at Canary Wharf, one of Moreau's surveillance teams spotted him leaving the building. The team leader, a former military operative named David Clark, immediately contacted his superiors and began following Marcus at a distance. Clark was experienced in urban surveillance and knew how to track someone without being detected. Marcus sensed he was being followed as he made his way toward the underground station. His months of living in fear had heightened his awareness of potential threats, and something about the movement patterns of pedestrians behind him seemed wrong. He quickened his pace and took several random turns to confirm his suspicions. Clark and his team adjusted their pursuit tactics, using multiple operatives to maintain surveillance while staying invisible. They had orders to capture Marcus alive if possible, but Moreau had made it clear that preventing him from reaching the police was more important than preserving his life. Marcus realized he was in immediate danger and activated one of his prepared escape plans. He ducked into a busy shopping center and used the complex layout to confuse his pursuers. The center had multiple levels connected by escalators and corridors that created numerous opportunities to change direction unexpectedly. During the chase, Marcus managed to lose Clark's team by entering a department store through one entrance and leaving through another while they were still searching the first floor. However, the incident confirmed that the criminals were actively hunting him and had the resources to mount sophisticated surveillance operations. Detective Inspector Mitchell received a call from one of her contacts in the Financial Crimes Unit. The contact had been reviewing bank records related to the shell companies, identified in Marcus's evidence, and had discovered a pattern of transactions that suggested the corruption network was much larger than initially suspected. The transactions involved accounts in multiple countries, suggesting that the criminal organization had international connections. Money was being moved through banks in Switzerland, Cyprus, and several Caribbean islands known for their banking secrecy laws. The complexity of the financial arrangements indicated that Moreau's organization was operating at a level far beyond typical street crime. Meanwhile, Detective Sergeant Williams was making final preparations to leave the country. He had booked a flight to Spain using false documents provided by Moreau's organization. Williams knew that once he left Britain, his ability to influence the investigation would be limited, but staying would almost certainly result in his arrest. Williams' departure was complicated by the fact that he had family in London who would be left behind. His wife and teenage daughter were unaware of his criminal activities, and explaining his sudden disappearance would be impossible without revealing the truth about his corruption. As evening approached, Marcus was making his way toward King's Cross Station to retrieve the audio recordings from the left luggage facility. These recordings contained conversations between Williams and other corrupt officials discussing specific cases they had manipulated and evidence they had destroyed. The recordings were potentially the most damaging evidence Marcus possessed because they directly implicated multiple officers in criminal activities. The conversations had been captured using a small recording device Marcus had hidden in his former boss's office during the period when he was still trying to understand the scope of the corruption. Vincent Moreau was becoming increasingly desperate as his organization faced the greatest threat in its history. The evidence Marcus had already provided to the police was bad enough, but Moreau suspected there was more hidden elsewhere. His contacts within the police department had confirmed that Detective Inspector Mitchell was building cases against multiple targets. Moreau decided that drastic action was necessary to protect his organization. He began planning an operation that would eliminate both Marcus and the police officers investigating the corruption. The plan involved staged accidents and apparent suicides that would remove the threats while avoiding obvious signs of criminal activity. As the third day of the crisis began to unfold, all parties were moving toward a confrontation that would determine the outcome of this extraordinary case. Marcus was becoming more desperate in his efforts to expose the truth, while the criminals hunting him were growing more aggressive in their methods. Detective Inspector Mitchell and her team were racing to build their cases before more evidence disappeared or witnesses were silenced. Detective Inspector Mitchell's worst fears were confirmed when she arrived at King's Cross Station and found the left luggage facility surrounded by crime scene tape. A security guard had been found unconscious in the facility's office, and several lockers had been broken into during the night. Among them was the locker Marcus had mentioned in his coded message to Mitchell. The attack on the storage facility represented a significant escalation in the criminal organization's response to the crisis. Vincent Moreau had decided that subtle approaches were no longer effective and had authorized his operatives to use more aggressive tactics. The security guard, fortunately, had survived the assault but was hospitalized with a serious head injury. Marcus learned about the break-in through news reports and realized that his pursuers were now actively working to destroy evidence faster than he could expose it. The audio recordings he had hidden at King's Cross were gone, eliminating crucial proof of conversations between corrupt police officers. This setback forced him to reconsider his strategy completely. Sarah Chen, the investigative journalist, had made a breakthrough in her parallel investigation. Through her sources in the banking industry, she had obtained information about suspicious financial transactions that correlated with the evidence Marcus had provided. Chen realized she might be the only person outside law enforcement who understood the full scope of the corruption network. Chen's investigation had led her to discover that Crawford's accounting firm was just one node in a web that included several other businesses across London. She found connections to a chain of restaurants that were reporting impossible revenues, a construction company that won contracts despite submitting inflated bids, and an import business that seemed to bring in far more goods than it could legitimately sell. Detective Sergeant Williams had successfully left the country, flying to Madrid using forged documents. However, his departure created new problems for Moreau's organization. Williams had been their primary source of information about police investigations, and losing that advantage left them operating partially blind. Williams's absence was quickly noticed by his colleagues at the Metropolitan Police. His failure to report for duty, combined with the evidence found in Marcus's cache, made his guilt obvious to everyone involved in the investigation. Chief Inspector Reynolds issued a warrant for Williams' arrest and alerted Interpol about his likely flight to Spain. Marcus decided that his only remaining option was to retrieve the evidence from the safety deposit box at the city bank. Despite the extreme danger this represented, the bank was located in the heart of London's financial district, an area with heavy security and surveillance that would make escape difficult if he was discovered. The safety deposit box contained the most comprehensive evidence Marcus had collected, including original documents that proved the connection between Moreau's criminal organization and various legitimate businesses. These papers showed not just money laundering, but also evidence of arms trafficking, drug distribution, and human trafficking operations. Marcus spent hours planning his approach to the bank, studying security camera locations, guard rotations, and escape routes. He realized that once he entered the bank, he would be committed to a course of action that would likely result in his capture or death. However, the evidence in that box was too important to leave hidden. Vincent Moreau had received intelligence about Marcus's possible target from one of his remaining contacts within the police. The informant had overheard discussions about the safety deposit box during meetings between Mitchell and her team. Moreau immediately began planning an ambush that would eliminate Marcus while he was attempting to access the bank. Moreau's plan involved positioning snipers on nearby buildings while ground teams controlled the escape routes from the bank. The operation was designed to look like a police response to a bank robbery gone wrong, providing cover for what would essentially be an assassination. Detective Inspector Mitchell was becoming increasingly frustrated with the constraints placed on her investigation by departmental politics and bureaucratic procedures. She knew that Marcus was running out of time and options, but her requests for additional resources and operational support were being delayed by administrators who seemed more concerned about public relations than catching criminals. Mitchell decided to take unauthorized action, using her personal contacts and resources to track Marcus independently of the official investigation. She had identified several locations where he might attempt to retrieve additional evidence, and she began positioning trusted officers to provide protection if needed. The breakthrough came when Mitchell's team intercepted communications between known criminals discussing an operation planned for the following day. The intercepts were vague, but references to the bank job and cleaning up the mess suggested that Moreau's organization was planning something significant. Marcus began his approach to the bank at dawn, hoping that early morning hours would provide some advantage. He had altered his appearance again, wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase to blend in with other early commuters in the financial district. The bank's security systems were more sophisticated than Marcus had anticipated. Multiple cameras with facial recognition capabilities monitored all entrances, and armed guards checked identification for anyone entering the safety deposit box area. Marcus realized that accessing his box would immediately reveal his location to anyone monitoring the bank's systems. Meanwhile, Moreau's operatives were taking positions around the bank. David Clark, who had previously tracked Marcus through Canary Wharf, was coordinating the ground team while two snipers were positioned on rooftops with clear views of the bank's entrances. The plan was to allow Marcus to enter the bank and then prevent him from leaving alive. Detective Inspector Mitchell had positioned herself in an unmarked vehicle near the bank, hoping to intercept Marcus before he walked into what she suspected was a trap. Her team was monitoring police communications and had noticed unusual activity in the area that suggested something significant was about to happen. As Marcus approached the bank's entrance, he noticed subtle signs that suggested the area was under surveillance. Vehicles parked in positions that provided good observation points, pedestrians who seemed to be loitering without purpose, and the general feeling that too many people were paying attention to the bank building. Marcus paused at a coffee shop across from the bank, trying to assess the situation. He could see that the safety deposit box area was visible from several windows in neighboring buildings, creating perfect sniper positions for anyone wanting to prevent his escape. The realization that he was walking into a trap forced him to reconsider his approach. Sarah Chen had been following the story throughout the night and had arrived in the financial district early that morning. Her investigation had led her to suspect that the bank contained crucial evidence, and she hoped to witness whatever was about to unfold. Chen positioned herself where she could observe both the bank and the surrounding area. The tension in the area was palpable as multiple parties prepared for a confrontation that none of them fully understood. Marcus knew he was outnumbered and outgunned, but the evidence in the safety deposit box represented his only chance to expose the truth. Detective Inspector Mitchell was trying to prevent violence while apprehending the criminals involved. Moreau's operatives were focused on eliminating the threat to their organization. Vincent Moreau himself had arrived to oversee the operation, parking several blocks away in a vehicle equipped with communications equipment that allowed him to coordinate his team's activities. This was the most important operation his organization had ever undertaken, and failure would likely mean the end of everything he had built. As the morning progressed, the various parties moved closer to a confrontation that would determine the outcome of the entire case. Marcus was preparing to make his move on the bank. Mitchell was trying to prevent a tragedy, and Moreau's operatives were waiting for the order to eliminate their target. The evidence in the safety deposit box had become the focal point of a battle between corruption and justice that would soon reach its climax. The morning air in London's financial district carried an unusual tension as Marcus finished his coffee and made his final decision. He had spotted at least 3 potential surveillance positions around the bank, confirming his suspicions about the trap being set for him. However, the evidence in the safety deposit box was too important to abandon, even if retrieving it cost him his life. Detective Inspector Mitchell had been monitoring radio traffic and noticed that several units were being positioned around the financial district. Under the guise of a security exercise, she recognized the pattern from previous operations. She had investigated where corrupt officers had provided cover for criminal activities. Mitchell realized that Moreau's organization had infiltrated the police response itself. Marcus devised a desperate plan that would require perfect timing and considerable luck. Instead of approaching the bank directly, he would use the underground maintenance tunnels he had mapped during his months in hiding. These tunnels connected to the building's basement level, potentially allowing him to access the bank without being seen by the surveillance teams above ground. Sarah Chen had positioned herself in a nearby cafe where she could observe the bank while appearing to work on her laptop. As an experienced investigative journalist, she recognized the signs of an impending confrontation. The unusual number of people trying to look inconspicuous, the vehicles positioned for quick escape, and the general atmosphere of tension all indicated that something significant was about to happen. Vincent Moreau was growing impatient as his operatives reported that Marcus had not yet approached the bank. The longer the operation continued, the more likely it became that legitimate police units would discover the trap. Moreau began to suspect that Marcus might have detected the surveillance and was planning an alternative approach. Marcus entered the tunnel system through a maintenance entrance 3 blocks from the bank. The underground passages were dark and required careful navigation, but he had practiced this route several times during his preparation. The tunnels were used primarily for utility maintenance and were rarely visited by security personnel or police. The approach through the tunnels took Marcus nearly an hour, as he had to navigate around obstacles and avoid making noise that might alert anyone above ground. When he finally reached the basement level of the bank building, he found himself in a mechanical room filled with heating and air conditioning equipment. Marcus had studied the building's layout extensively and knew that the safety deposit box area was accessible through a service corridor that connected to the basement. However, reaching that corridor required passing through sections of the building that were monitored by security cameras and patrolled by guards. Detective Inspector Mitchell made a critical decision to enter the bank herself, using her official credentials to gain access while her team maintained surveillance on the surrounding area. She hoped to reach Marcus before Moreau's operatives could eliminate him, even though doing so would likely expose her investigation to the corrupt officers involved in the operation. As Mitchell entered the bank, she noticed that the security arrangements seemed unusually heavy for a normal business day. Extra guards were stationed at key positions, and several individuals in the lobby appeared to be conducting surveillance rather than banking business. The setup confirmed her fears about the scope of the trap. Marcus successfully reached the service corridor and began making his way toward the safety deposit box area. The building's security systems were sophisticated, but they were designed to prevent unauthorized access from public areas rather than from service corridors used by maintenance personnel. The safety deposit box area was located on the 2nd floor of the bank, requiring Marcus to use a service elevator that he hoped would not trigger additional security alerts. As the elevator climbed, he prepared himself for what might be his final actions as a free man. Meanwhile, David Clark and his surveillance team had noticed Detective Inspector Mitchell entering the bank and realized that law enforcement was becoming directly involved in the situation. Clark contacted Moreau to report this development, knowing that the presence of honest police officers would complicate their assassination plan. Moreau decided that the operation had become too risky to continue as originally planned. Instead of trying to eliminate Marcus in the bank, he ordered his team to focus on preventing the evidence from reaching the police. This meant that Marcus might be allowed to retrieve the contents of the safety deposit box, but would be eliminated before he could escape the building. Marcus reached the safety deposit box area and began the process of accessing his box. The bank's security procedures required him to provide identification and a key, both of which he had prepared months earlier. The clerk assisting him seemed nervous, possibly recognizing him from news coverage or sensing the unusual tension in the building. Detective Inspector Mitchell had positioned herself in the bank's lobby where she could monitor access to the safety deposit box area while maintaining communication with her team outside. She was hoping to identify Marcus when he attempted to leave the building and provide protection during his escape. The contents of Marcus's safety deposit box represented years of careful evidence collection. Along with financial documents and photographs, the box contained digital storage devices with encrypted files that detailed the full scope of the criminal network's operations. The evidence implicated dozens of corrupt officials and criminals across London and beyond. As Marcus secured the evidence in his briefcase, he realized that escaping the building would be nearly impossible using conventional routes. The surveillance teams outside would be watching all normal exits, and the basement tunnels he had used to enter were too dangerous to navigate while carrying the crucial evidence. Sarah Chen had been monitoring police radio frequencies using equipment she had acquired for previous investigations. She overheard communications that suggested a major operation was in progress in the financial district, confirming her suspicions about the significance of the day's events. Marcus decided to use the most unexpected escape route possible. Instead of trying to leave through the building's ground level, he would access the roof and attempt to reach adjacent buildings using maintenance walkways that connected the structures in the financial district. The journey to the roof required Marcus to navigate through several floors of the building while avoiding security. cameras, and personnel. He used his knowledge of the building's service areas to stay out of sight. But each floor brought new risks of discovery. Detective Inspector Mitchell realized that Marcus was taking much longer than expected to complete his business at the bank. She began to suspect that he had encountered problems or was planning an unconventional exit strategy. Mitchell positioned her team to cover additional escape routes while maintaining surveillance. On the primary exits, Vincent, Moreau was becoming increasingly agitated as the operation stretched beyond its planned timeline. His organization thrived on quick, clean operations that left no traces for investigators to follow. The extended confrontation at the bank was creating too many opportunities for legitimate law enforcement to become involved and potentially uncover the criminal network's activities. Marcus successfully reached the roof of the bank building after navigating through maintenance areas and service staircases. The London skyline spread out before him, with the interconnected buildings of the financial district offering a potential escape route that his pursuers had not anticipated. However, moving between buildings would require crossing exposed areas where snipers might have clear shots. The rooftop escape plan had been Marcus's most desperate contingency, one he had hoped never to use. The walkways between buildings were intended for maintenance access and were not designed for the kind of chase scenario he was about to attempt. A single misstep could result in a fatal fall, even without interference from criminal operatives. David Clark received orders from Moreau to reposition his team to cover the building's roof access points. Clark realized that their target was more resourceful than initially anticipated and began coordinating with the sniper teams to establish firing positions that could cover the rooftop areas. As Marcus prepared to cross to the adjacent building, he noticed movement in windows across the street that suggested sniper positions were being established. The criminal organization's response had been swift and professional, confirming that he was dealing with people who had significant resources and experience in this type of operation. Detective Inspector Mitchell made the decision to enter the bank's upper floors, using her police credentials to bypass security restrictions. She hoped to locate Marcus before the criminal operatives could eliminate him, even though doing so would expose her presence to any corrupt officers who might be monitoring the situation. The first building-to-building crossing was the most dangerous part of Marcus's escape plan. The walkway was narrow and partially exposed, requiring him to move quickly while carrying the briefcase containing the crucial evidence. As he began the crossing, he heard the distinctive crack of a sniper rifle and felt the concrete near his feet explode from the impact. Marcus completed the crossing despite the sniper fire, reaching the adjacent building as additional. Marcus reached the edge of the final building in his escape route and faced a decision that would determine his fate. Below him, the street bustled with normal London traffic, offering the possibility of disappearing into the crowd, but also presenting the risk of being cornered by criminal operatives who were certainly repositioning at ground level. Detective Inspector Mitchell had successfully followed Marcus's path across the rooftops and was now close enough to call out to him. She identified herself as a police officer and assured him that she was there to help, not to arrest him. However, Marcus's months of running from both criminals and corrupt police had made him suspicious of anyone in authority. "Marcus Dane," Mitchell called across the rooftop. "I'm Detective Inspector Mitchell. I've been investigating the corruption you exposed. I found the evidence you left at Victoria Station. I'm here to help you survive this." Marcus paused at the building's edge, weighing his options. The detective's knowledge of the Victoria Station evidence suggested she might be legitimate, but his experience had taught him that the criminal network had infiltrated multiple levels of law enforcement. Trusting the wrong person at this moment could cost him his life. Sarah Chen had positioned herself strategically on the street below and was documenting the rooftop confrontation with her camera. The dramatic scene of police and criminals pursuing a lone whistleblower across London's skyline would become one of the most significant news stories of the year. Vincent Moreau had retreated to his command vehicle several blocks away, monitoring the situation through communications with his remaining operatives. The failure to eliminate Marcus quietly had already caused significant damage to his organization, and Moreau was now focused on limiting further exposure rather than completing the original mission. Marcus made his decision and began descending the building using an external fire escape, with Detective Inspector Mitchell following close behind. The descent was dangerous, but it offered the best chance of reaching street level, while avoiding the building's interior, where criminal operatives might be waiting. As Marcus reached the third floor of the fire escape, he noticed several suspicious vehicles positioning themselves around the building's exits. David Clark and his team had successfully anticipated his likely descent route and were preparing to intercept him at ground level. Detective Inspector Mitchell had coordinated with her trusted team members to provide protection during Marcus's descent. Unmarked police vehicles were moving into position to counter the criminal operatives, setting up a confrontation between legitimate law enforcement and Moreau's organization. The final confrontation began when Marcus reached the second floor of the fire escape and found himself caught between criminal operatives on the street and the uncertainty of whether Detective Inspector Mitchell could be trusted. The briefcase containing the crucial evidence had become the center of a three-way struggle for control. Marcus made a desperate decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to reach the ground safely, he threw the briefcase containing the evidence directly to Sarah Chen, who was positioned below with her camera equipment. The journalist had been documenting the entire confrontation and represented the best hope for ensuring the evidence would reach the public. Sarah Chen caught the briefcase and immediately understood its significance. As both criminal operatives and police officers began moving toward her position, she made the quick decision to broadcast live footage of the contents using her mobile equipment. The evidence would be transmitted to her newsroom in real time, making it impossible for anyone to suppress or destroy. The live broadcast of Marcus's evidence created immediate chaos among all parties involved. Vincent Moreau's organization could no longer hope to contain the situation quietly, while corrupt police officers faced the prospect of their activities being exposed to the public in real time. Detective Inspector Mitchell seized the opportunity created by the broadcast to arrest several criminal operatives who were now exposed in the street. The live coverage provided protection for legitimate law enforcement officers while making it impossible for corrupt officials to interfere with the arrests. Marcus used the confusion to complete his descent and reach street level, where Detective Inspector Mitchell was able to provide him with official protection. For the first time in months, he was safe from the criminal organization that had been hunting him. David Clark and the remaining criminal operatives were forced to retreat as legitimate police units arrived to secure the area. The live broadcast had made their positions untenable, and continuing the operation would only result in their capture. Vincent Moreau realized that his organization was finished and began implementing emergency protocols designed to protect himself while abandoning the network he had spent years building. The evidence Marcus had collected was now public, making it impossible to continue operating in London. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation saw Marcus taken into protective custody while Detective Inspector Mitchell coordinated the largest corruption investigation in Metropolitan Police history. The evidence he had risked his life to preserve would ultimately lead to dozens of arrests and convictions. Sarah Chen's live broadcast of the evidence became a sensation that exposed the full scope of the criminal network's activities. Her documentation of the rooftop chase and final confrontation provided crucial visual proof of the organization's willingness to use lethal force to protect their operations. Detective Sergeant Williams was arrested in Madrid 3 days later, when Spanish authorities acted on the international warrant issued after his identity was confirmed through Marcus's evidence. His extradition to Britain would provide investigators with additional information about the network's operations. Crawford's accounting firm was raided, simultaneously with dozens of other businesses identified in Marcus's evidence. The coordinated operation dismantled the money laundering network and froze millions of pounds in criminal assets. Marcus's courage in exposing the corruption network despite overwhelming personal risk became a symbol of the importance of whistleblower protection. His case led to significant reforms in how law enforcement agencies handle corruption, investigations, and protect individuals who come forward with evidence of criminal activities. Vincent Moreau disappeared completely after the collapse of his organization. Despite international efforts to locate him, intelligence reports suggested he had fled to a country without extradition treaties with Britain, but his London-based network was permanently destroyed. Detective Inspector Mitchell was promoted to Chief Inspector in recognition of her work on the corruption case. She became a leading advocate for police reform and transparency, using lessons learned from Marcus's case to improve how law enforcement agencies handle internal corruption. The evidence Marcus had preserved led to convictions of 12 police officers, 37 criminals, and the closure of 23 businesses involved in money laundering. The investigation revealed corruption that reached into multiple government agencies and private sector organizations. Marcus entered witness protection while the trials proceeded, but eventually chose to testify publicly about his experiences. His testimony provided crucial evidence for the prosecution and helped ensure that the full scope of the criminal network was exposed to public scrutiny. The case became a landmark in British legal history, demonstrating both the dangers faced by individuals who expose corruption and the importance of protecting those brave enough to come forward. Marcus's dramatic gesture at Buckingham Palace, which had seemed like the desperate act of a frightened man, ultimately proved to be the key to dismantling one of London's most sophisticated criminal organizations. The final outcome vindicated Marcus's decision to risk everything to expose the truth. Though he could never return to his normal life, his actions had protected countless future victims and restored integrity to institutions that had been compromised by corruption. His disappearance at Buckingham Palace had been the beginning of his real emergence as one of the most important whistleblowers in modern British history.